Ministry of Music. Who am I? Where am I going? Questions of identity and questions of purpose have without a doubt driven more discussion and spilled more ink and sparked more conflict than any other questions in history. Who am I? Where am I going? These are questions that are asked in every age that cross racial and ethnic boundaries and defy economic and social distinctives. Who am I? Where am I going? These questions have driven philosophers, poets, novelists, and filmmakers alike for the last 5 centuries, and today we are still no closer to an answer than we were then. Who am I? Where am I going? These are questions that the church must grapple with, not only because we believe that we have eternal answers to these questions found in the pages of Scripture, not only because we live in a world where these questions are left unanswered and produce more despair and anxiety than we ever thought possible, but because, as a church, questions of identity and questions of purpose are central to our survival. What does it mean today to be a Christ follower when there are a million other things that I can be? What does God have in store for us at this place and in this time? Who am I? Where am I going? These are the questions behind all the other questions that you'll ask. These are the questions beneath every fight and disagreement you'll have. These are the questions at the root of both success and failure. Who am I? Where am I going? These are the questions of a now, but not yet, people. When Moses climbed the mountain after 40 years of wandering in the wilderness and looked over the Jordan River, he saw the promised land. He saw what God had been preparing for his people, and in that moment, Moses knew what it was to become a now but not yet leader. The Exodus was over. The people were home. So Moses asks the question, who am I now that the Exodus is over? Where are we going now? When Ezra and Nehemiah returned to Jerusalem after a generation in Babylon and saw a city broken, they determined that Jerusalem could one day live again. And in that moment of casting a vision that they wouldn't see completed, that their children wouldn't see completed, they became themselves now but not yet people. And were forced to ask the question, who do we want to be now that we get to build this again? In view of everything we've been through, in light of all that's happened to us, who will we choose to be from this moment on? The other day, as I was driving home, I happened to look up at the sky and think to myself, I love these long, late summer evenings. And I know saying that in May in Calgary is a little bit like tempting fate. But it was in that moment that it actually struck me that summer's here, and if summer's here, that means Tim's arrival is soon. And if Tim's arrival is soon, then the waiting, this long period of waiting that we've been in as a church is finally almost at an end. Just, not yet. We are a people in waiting. And so it's fitting that as the church remembers its birth and celebrates this day of Pentecost, that we would take a few moments together this morning to reflect on the purpose and identity that the Spirit imparts to us as a church. Because people in waiting are always called to prepare. For 400 years, between the Old and the New Testament, God was silent. From the closing of Malachi to the opening of Matthew, God said nothing to his people. But in that silence was a voice calling in the wilderness. In that silence, John reminds us, and as we'll see in the next few weeks, was a call for the people of God to prepare themselves for what God was about to do. to become as a whole people, a now but not yet nation. We are called in this period of waiting to prepare. Prepare because this new thing that God is inviting us into, this holy mess that we call church, is invited into not as servants, not as second-class citizens, not as latecomers to the party, but as partners in a mission of good news to the whole world. The church does nothing without preparation. We prepare for Christmas with Advent. We prepare for Easter with Lent. We prepare for Pentecost with Easter. Preparation is an act of grace that God gives to the church, because while God could go from 0 to 80 like that, God wants us to be partners in this. He gives us the grace and the space to prepare so that we can catch up to where God is already going. And in the case of Christ, it was the first arrival. It was the first arrival on the scene was the baptizer. This man named John, cousin to Jesus, one who was called to prepare. In John the Baptizer, John the Baptist, the church is given a model for preparation, a portrait to imitate, to learn from as we grow into our now but not yet selves. Who am I? Where am I going? And what we find here in this morning's reading, this earliest mention of John, is that both of those truths, both of the answers to those questions, are rooted in eternity itself. John begins his gospel by reminding us that what he's writing here is not actually history. John's gospel differs from the others, which are referred to as synoptics, by letting the reader make no mistake that what he's doing is not writing accurate history. Things happen out of order all the time in John's gospel. John is not interested in the events that happen, but the significance that the events that happen carry. And so John roots his gospel actually in the moment of creation itself. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And here at the beginning, here rooted in eternity itself, before time and space were even things to be considered, we find John's namesake. It's an interlude, sure, probably there, scholars believe, to remind those few holdouts who still followed John the Baptizer that John was actually part of a bigger story. That still following John was a little bit like going to a concert just to see the opening act. But none of that means the baptizer is unimportant. Questions of identity and purpose are not limited by who you are or what you're doing, because those things will always be temporary things. Why do you think that anxiety, depression, and mental illness are at an all-time high in Canadian society today, especially among the youngest people? Because if your identity and your purpose is rooted in who you are, I have bad news for you. Who you are will die. If your identity and your purpose are rooted in what you do, I have bad news for you. What you do will fade away. Your memories will turn to dust. The most significant influencers today in culture will be footnotes in 100 years. But like the baptizer, like John, if we find our identity and our purpose rooted in eternity itself, then nothing can ever take that away. So how? How do we find in eternity, how do we find an eternal identity and an eternal purpose? John says that the baptizer came as a witness to testify to eternity's light. Witnessing wasn't what he did. Witnessing was who he was. In 1996, a 38-year-old security guard at a Pennsylvania middle school convinced a 14-year-old Tanya Koch to leave her father and live with him. For the next 10 years, he kept Tanya captive in the home he shared with his elderly parents. And to keep her from running away, he convinced her that no one cared about her. No one cared that she was gone and that her parents weren't even looking for her. You're stupid and immature, that he told her every single day. Nobody cares about you except me. Eventually, the guard became so confident in Tanya's loyalty that he allowed her to leave the house for short periods of time while he was at work. Through these excursions, Tanya became friends with Joseph Sparico, the owner of the local deli. In March of 2006, Tanya finally confessed her true identity to Sparico, who shared this information with his son, a police officer. Before long, Tanya was rescued and reunited with her father. Commenting on the girl's situation, Sparico said she wanted to be wanted. That's all. Tanya's father, Jeremy, had desperately tried to find his daughter over the years. He posted her picture almost 1,000 times on flyers and on milk cartons, and to say he was overjoyed to see her was an understatement. There wasn't a day that went by that he didn't think about his little girl. All I can say is thank God my little girl is back home. Tanya, too, was delighted to learn that her father had never actually given up looking for her. Commenting on it, on the reunion, she said, he's crying, I'm crying, and all he keeps saying is, I've got my baby girl back. It's easy to forget who we are in a world that tells us over and over again that we're cosmic accidents, that we're a collection of stardust, no different from the dirt on which we stand, no more significant than any other animal or any other beast. And over again, as we hear that message that no one is actually out there looking for us, over and over again, as we hear a voice resonate deep inside of us that we are immature, that we are worthless, that there is no one actually searching, desperately longing, going door to door looking for us, we start to believe it. We start to live as though we're finite beings. We start to live as though if this life is all I get, I might as well make the most of it. Since this job is all I'll ever be, I might as well do it, and even if it costs me everything else. But you are not made to be finite. You are an image bearer of the God who made all of creation, the one who stands outside of eternity, and like the baptizer before you, calls you to be witness bearers to the light of Christ that has come into the world today. Your identity, who you are, is rooted in who God is. Because God has marked you as his own. God didn't casually make dust and turn it into something. God said, let us make man and woman in our image. Who am I? I am an image bearer of the Creator of all things. You were always intentional. And it is the goal of the church each and every day to live life with that intention. We are not accidents. We are not happenstance. We are not just stardust. Life is not random. God is bigger than any fork in the road or any unexpected circumstance can ever be. This is the witness you bear. And like it, your purpose. Because purpose is an identity statement. The baptizer was not the light, says John. The baptizer came to testify to the light. He lived as a witness, and he worked out of his sense of identity. So your job is fine, but your job's not what you do. Your hobbies are great, but your hobbies aren't your purpose. Your purpose is found in understanding exactly who God has created you to be and living that truth every day from now until the end of time. Purpose is an identity statement. It's a little bit like the conversation Alice has with the Cheshire Cat, where she says, "Would you tell me, please, which way I ought to go from here?" "Well, that depends," replies the cat, "a good deal on where you want to get to." "I don't much care where," said Alice. "Then it doesn't matter which way you go," said the cat. When you understand who God has made you to be, what God is calling you to do will become clear. Because when you understand who God has made you to be, you begin to see all of the gifts and skills that you have inside of you, all of the talents that you possess, as obscure as they are, not as things to be hidden, not as things to be pushed aside, but as intentional marks of God's infinity placed on your soul. We live in a culture that says some things, some gifts, and some skills are just plain better than others. The market will decide what's valuable and who is valuable. If you contribute, great. You get the big house and the fancy car. If you don't, you get the small studio apartment and the 1996 Dodge Caravan. But God takes all of that and says, none of that has a lick of influence on what I have actually made you to do. I have made each and every one of you exactly the way you were supposed to be. The psalmist says God has knitted us together in our mother's womb. He carefully and intentionally took every strand of your DNA and put it exactly where he wanted it to be. Your personality is the way God wanted you to be. Your desires are the way God wanted you to be. Your hopes and dreams are the way God wanted you to be. And so into our culture, we stand against the culture's definition of purpose and say, forget that. We stand and say, I know who God has made me to be, and so I am going to do what God has put me on this earth right now in this moment to do. And I'm going to do it until I cannot do it anymore, and then I'm going to do it some more. Because Frederick Buechner said, the place God is calling you to is the place where your deep joy meets the world's deep need. That is the definition of purpose. What am I here for? I am here to do exactly what God has made me to do, what God has created and uniquely crafted me to do. In eternity, we find our purpose, our identity, and at the beginning, the starting point from which all preparation stems. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Let us continue to worship this morning as we present to God his tithe and our offerings.